Good afternoon and good morning to those of you joining us out west. I'm Karen Langdon with the National Emergency Management Association. I'd like to welcome you to the NEMA Empowerment e-learning series. We're very excited to showcase the expertise of some of our members in this series, and today we're happy to present emerging Earth observational technologies and their impacts on the future of disaster response, recovery, and resilience. A big thank you to ICEYE for supporting today's topic. Welcome, Mike. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Karen. Myself and everyone at ICEYE really appreciates the opportunity to host this panel discussion on emerging Earth observation technologies and their impacts to the emergency management community. We hope it's informative for everyone watching from the office or at home or wherever you're situated these days. We've got a great panel of speakers here today, experts in their respective fields who I'd like to introduce. So I want to take some time, first of all, before we get started, to introduce our panel. First, we have Catherine Vaughn. Catherine's Associate Vice President for Dewberry's Geospatial Technology Services. For 27 years, Catherine has used geospatial technologies to help FEMA, state, private entities, and local governments make faster, more informed decisions. Ms. Vaughn has led the development of several innovative uses of geospatial technology to drive outcomes for emergency management efforts. In examples, developing a standard process to produce geospatial damage assessments that either are modeled, incorporating flood and inundation extents, visual using post-event imagery, field using geospatial field tools, or using machine learning, which won the Greater Washington Professional Services Innovator of the Year Award. Next, we have Dr. Dragos Bratasanyu, all the way from New Zealand. Dragos is an Earth observation and geospatial data strategist with 14 years of experience in the geospatial industry. He holds a PhD in artificial intelligence for Earth observation from the University of Siegen in Germany and has received several awards for his research and innovation in the space industry. Dragos presently leads the development and deployment of several geospatial strategies for the Auckland Council. He previously served with DLR German Aerospace Center as a science manager for the largest artificial intelligence for Earth observation center in Europe, and with the Romanian space agency ROSA. His interests include Earth observation strategy development and delivery, EO program and project management, and new space. Next up, we have Aaron Michael. Aaron is Senior Product Manager and Vice President of Public Sector Solutions at Swiss Re, who specializes in the development of innovative insurance products for a global portfolio of public clients. His background focuses on natural catastrophe, parametric risk transfer design and implementation for earthquakes, tropical cyclones, floods, extreme weather, and supply chains. Previously, Aaron served as the CTO at Global Parametrics and a senior engineer at Veris AIR Worldwide. Aaron holds a PhD and MS in structural engineering from Stanford University and is a licensed professional engineer and post-earthquake structural inspector in the state of California. And finally, we have Jeff Barani. Jeff currently serves as lead solution engineer on the public safety team for emergency management and disaster response. He is responsible for working closely with the community to discover, develop, and promote best practices in the use of ArcGIS to support the emergency management mission. Jeff also helps lead our ESRI disaster response program, which provides GIS support to organizations during disasters and crises. He's been with ESRI since 2000, started as a consultant in the professional services group. He holds a Master of Engineering in Applied Remote Sensing and Geographic Information Systems and a BS in Biology from the University of Michigan. Before we begin with the panel, I'd like to do a little bit of introduction for ICEYE for those that don't know. ICEYE delivers unmatched persistent monitoring capabilities for any location on Earth, owning the world's largest synthetic aperture radar constellation. The company enables objective, data-driven decisions for its customers in sectors such as insurance and emergency management. ICEYE's data can be collected day or night, or even through cloud cover, allowing for near real-time hazard insights, including for floods and wildfires, to be delivered to critical stakeholders, creating unprecedented situational awareness and empowering crucial decision-making. For the industry as a whole, Earth observation from space enables accurate insights into unfolding natural disasters. The ability to detect what has occurred quickly and gauge where the worst damage has likely taken place in hours rather than days or weeks can be a game changer for emergency management, enabling the deployment of resources with more confidence, delivery of assistance more swiftly, and ultimately identifying new ways to build financial resilience in the face of a changing climate. Each of the panelists here today represents a different perspective on emergency management and on the use of Earth observation data in the field. So without further ado, let me get started here. Jeff, I'm going to start with you. ICEYE has been enabling emergency management officials for years to better target impacted areas after a natural disaster with quicker and more efficient response and recovery capabilities. Can you discuss and walk us through perhaps a couple of examples of that?
Yeah, sure, Mike. Well, yeah, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you all today, and thanks to ICEYE for having us on. I guess, to your question, first of all, what we've kind of learned and observed from the user community in terms of, GIS supporting, the response phase of emergency management is the three kind of key capabilities that people are looking for, and we see in practice all the time are situational awareness, damage assessment, and information sharing. So, and this is, seems to be validated with each kind of ensuing disaster or crisis. And what we wanted to share today, what I wanted to share today is really kind of to take a look at this, in a bit more detail and, look at this, live. So in this case, what we're looking at here is a swipe app. Now, this is a traditional information product that we'll put together with Earth observation data after disaster, the post-event imagery or whatever the case, may be. But in this case, the data from ICEYE is really compelling and game-changing, as Mike said. The ability to see through clouds, leveraging the power of synthetic aperture radar, really gives decision makers and first responders a really quick picture of the extent of damage. And obviously this can be refined over time, but what we're looking at here is an example of the data that ICEYE received from ICEYE after Hurricane Ian, given our partnership, and we're able to put it into viewers, quickly like this to start to understand, the potential impact, in an area. But it's not just the picture of the data, right, and the visual kind of extent. From a GIS perspective, we have, kind of a handle on the geometry and, what GIS folks are looking for after a disaster. Basically, the big bad blue polygon, right, of where the damage is. And so in this case, we've taken the ICEYE flood extent that we, received, for this, particular area. We intersected that by sub-watershed, so we can see, different sections of the area and look at the potential impact. And given kind of having this, extent and this, data at our fingertips, we are able to more quickly understand the potential impact. And, really what that means is, what, who and what's impacted, after an event. So in this case, in this section, looking at the census tracts, we can see, 30,000 people in this area, nearly half are over 65, who obviously might require, additional resources, schools, nursing homes, hospitals, basically our values. And even looking at, things like structure data, right? Where's the, the structures that are impacted and the ability to see that, kind of early on. So, situational awareness is one of those kind of key capabilities that folks are looking for, and that is certainly dramatically enhanced with Earth observation data coming from ICEYE. So yeah, just a couple of examples that we wanted to share with you on today's panel discussion.
Thanks. So outside of even just ICEYE data, I mean, where do you see Earth observation technology coming into play for GIS technology?
The main thing from our perspective, and certainly there's the baseline, data for that, everyone's got their, favorite imagery, base map. But, from an Earth observation perspective, the real power is, the ability to quickly understand, the impact, of an event, whether that's, aerial photographs, UASs, satellites. I think for many years, the community has been kind of come to expect those traditional, visible and IR products. But I think, the ability to leverage the power of synthetic aperture radar data quickly now is a real game changer, and, help us get to those who and what's impacted, questions quicker. And I don't know if you permit me, just on a side note, kind of a personal anecdote. We shared that, kind of slider view internally within ESRI, after Hurricane Ian hit. And as a part of our disaster response program work, everyone with ESRI is always looking for, information internally, either for their customers mostly, but sometimes, their relatives. I felt like half of ESRI had a stubborn grandma or a mother-in-law that lived in Florida. And, they were coming to these viewers that I just showed to understand, where their families were impacted, and really helped them understand the kind of potential of this powerful new capability.
I'm going to come back to you, Jeff, a little bit later on to try to play prognosticator a little bit in the industry, but I want to shift the focus for now, at least, and move on to some other elements here and some other panel speakers. According to NOAA, there were $18 billion disasters in 2022 in the U.S. alone. We know the U.S. isn't the only location that's seen significant natural disaster losses, though, and globally, the total economic losses in 2022 amounted to more than $300 billion, according to Aon. New Zealand, one area that hasn't been spared. Just this year, we know New Zealand's been hit by multiple disasters just over the last few months. Auckland was first hit in January by historic flooding, where an entire summer's worth of rain fell in just a single day. And then a few weeks later, the Northern Ireland was impacted by the powerful cyclone Gabrielle, which has so far caused a financial toll similar to the 2011 Christchurch earthquake. For both of these events, on-the-ground access to many communities was shut off entirely because of flooding, and the sheer scale of the disaster made it hard to plan traditional emergency management activities. So let me shift Dragos to you. How did Earth observation technology help you and help New Zealand in this disaster?
Thank you, Michael. So just because I like to keep things very simple, for those who don't know, so Earth observation simply means data captured from or about a location on Earth, from above. And it can be from above from a few tens of meters, which is drones. It can be a few hundreds of meters, helicopter. It can be maybe 2,000 meters using an airplane, or hundreds of kilometers using satellites. So when disaster strikes, especially in New Zealand, what we've done is we employed all of these technologies in various areas to be able to assess what has happened on the ground. But before this happened, what we've done, actually, we had a baseline for the next 3 to 7 years through various strategies. So I put in place a geospatial imagery strategy. We have an open data strategy at Auckland Council, and we have a LiDAR strategy. And out of these strategies have flown out various products. So we have imagery apps in which all our users can actually have access to the latest imagery. We have an open data portal, and we have also elevation products that we make available to the public. Now, when the hurricane came, when the cyclone came, this is what happened in the next slide. So what was used on open data basically as a baseline, it just everything spiked, especially the flood-related data sets. For example, you see here the floodplains from Auckland. We had roughly 300-400 users a day. It jumped to 16,000 in a single day. So all these products have been put in place on a BAU, business as usual. But the moment disaster hit, everyone who had an interest just came, and the products were available. Next slide, please. So just to give you a few examples, what we've done, we have, the moment disaster hit, we employed satellites. For example, Maxar, we got a whole mosaic of Auckland covered. You see here a landslide following the cyclone. Next slide. We had teams who deployed drones, and they created 3D models and drone photography of areas where landslides happened, that in some of these areas, it was very hard to get access. Next slide. They've also used LiDAR to see the changes in elevation in these areas from helicopter. Next slide. And also, the moment the flooding came, I reached out to ICEYE and I requested, because of the possibility to see through clouds, I requested them to task the satellites and actually produce maps for us to see the extent of the flooding. And this was done immediately in the following hours, maybe one day at the latest after the flood. Next slide. So what you see here is a 3D model created from drones using both photography and LiDAR capabilities. So when disasters strike, from our point of view, Earth observation is actually the only way to be able to have a bird's eye view over the area of interest, whether it's a localized area like you see here to assess damage in a local community, or whether it's over the entire Auckland. And by the way, Auckland is one of the largest cities in Australia and Asia combined. It's massive. So satellites is actually the only way to go for us.
So you're using different types of satellites, Dragos. You're using different types of drones and aerial imagery here, and whether it's LiDAR or SAR or optical. I guess my question here would be for Jeff. How does GIS technology then help to combine that and enable the emergency management community to actually digest all of these different feeds?
You saw some great examples there from Dragos, and really put in great work by Dragos and his team in the city of Auckland, have been in really kind of putting those principles into play, right? I think they're probably struggling to get a sense of the impact, and the clouds weren't clearing fast enough for traditional means, and being able to leverage the ICEYE data to get to those answers, not only to see the extent, but then go on the ground and do damage assessments and being able to understand from the field and validate that information that you were getting that was real. So yeah, a great use of the technology there. So well done.
And then Catherine, from the A&E perspective, I mean, do you see similar type of work going on in the U.S. with disasters as well?
Yeah, definitely. And first of all, thank you, Mike and ICEYE, for having us today. I'm super excited to be here, and can't say enough what perfect timing this session is. For those who attended the NEMA mid-year conference, there was a session during the response and recovery section where one of the presenters talked about the use of geospatial technologies and how it expedited recovery and response efforts. That's amazing. And I'm so glad to continue the conversation here today. So back to your question, we've used post-event imagery to identify the location of inaccessible communities and assessing damages. It's great for situational awareness after an event, but to really maximize the use and get some of the outputs that Dragos talked about, you need to be able to have a plan on how you're going to use the imagery, when it's going to be acquired, what analysis is going to be done. So the timeliness of acquisition and the analysis is extremely important, because the key to all of this is getting the hands of the imagery and the analysis into emergency managers so they can make those more informed decisions.
And Catherine, I do want to come back to you in just a second with a little bit more of a U.S. focus, but kind of staying on the New Zealand run here. Aaron, I'm going to ask you some questions shortly on the insurance industry's role in this, but New Zealand specifically, how has the insurance industry traditionally helped at the disaster risk finance level, and how do you think that will evolve now that we've seen these back-to-back floods and as we continue to see changing climate produce bigger and bigger and costlier storms? Dragos, let me come back to you. The only panelist here that has a PhD in artificial intelligence for Earth observation, and you've worked at the German equivalent of NASA DLR. So how do you see the future of Earth observation technology continuing to evolve for situations like this in New Zealand and for situations globally as well?
Michael, I think here there's two questions, and there's on one hand you have the continuous development of AI, of machine learning, and all those technologies, But on the other hand, you obviously have the interest of the responders to disasters. So, for example, when you think of AI is simply a general term for extracting information, knowledge from large amounts of data, in this case, Earth observation. So what was once done manually by a human expert now can be done to a degree through AI and machine learning. However, I think it's really important that we keep in mind that AI is not the end itself, is just a means to an end. So because the end itself is the information, the knowledge to be able to act on the ground. So both AI, both EO are tools to enable an output for the responders. So I think the data analytics companies will keep innovating, will keep, the tools will continue to evolve. For example, because the amounts of data nowadays are so big, it would take a human user maybe even years to do what a machine can now do in a matter of minutes. So as the AI tools will continue to grow, we can tap into larger areas, larger scales to analyze. But I also think the output will always have to be checked by a human user. We can't just pull whatever comes out and use. We will always have a human user actually checking the output and then transforming that into applicable actions on the ground. So that's what I think is going to happen. As disaster strikes, all of those tools will be able to automate and to make it much faster. But still, that's not the end of itself. The end is taking action on the ground.
So the actionable output and what you do with the data.
Yeah.
Great. Let me shift back to the question then around the insurance industry in New Zealand, and this will play into later on when we talk about a little bit more around how the insurance industry supports disaster resilience in the U.S. But as far as New Zealand goes, how has the industry supported the response and recovery efforts there, and where do you see the industry going?
So New Zealand is a long-time insurance buyer, and actually, of all the countries in the world, New Zealand has some of the best insurance penetration of any country, and so insurance really has helped to prop up New Zealand following major natural catastrophes. And I think the 2010 Christchurch earthquake sequence was a good example of that, where that sequence alone cost about 20% of New Zealand's GDP. And you can think about the burden that would impose on the federal government were it not for being able to offload some of that risk to the insurance sector. And so just in general, it allows emergency planners to do their job, because then they don't have to worry so much about the budget uncertainty that comes along with natural catastrophes if you don't have them adequately outsourced to a risk taker.
So I appreciate the international focus of this one, kind of stepping back into the U.S. Catherine, I want to shift to you here, and we'll come back to the insurance angle, but I think Dragos actually laid up pretty well on the machine learning element, a little bit of your work and your work with FEMA. We know in the U.S., FEMA's individual assistance and public assistance programs help to provide funds after a disaster intended to meet basic needs and supplement disaster recovery efforts, including use for temporary housing, repairs on owner-occupied homes, community debris removal, restoring public infrastructure, things like that. So can you talk a little bit about how Dewberry supports programs like this with Earth observation data and machine learning capabilities, as well as supporting response efforts through your work with the organization?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And Dragos, you couldn't have set up this talk better. So thank you for doing that. Dewberry's been involved in emergency management operations at all levels of government really since the 1970s, and leveraging technology to help expedite efforts. What I want to talk to you today is about how we're using Earth observation and machine learning for what we call geospatial damage assessments. So first of all, what are geospatial damage assessments? It's a way to categorize impact on structures for the entire event area. And how do you do this? You integrate geospatial data and technology in automation. You want to do this anywhere data exists. Data is key. Always think about that. In order to have a good analysis, you need to have high quality data. And you want this done as fast as possible so that the emergency managers can have a quick understanding of the impact and assist with response and recovery efforts. Next slide. I really think there's about 4 main types of geospatial damage assessments. There are others, but you can, like Mike mentioned in my introduction, there's field assessments where you can use mobile technology to go inside and outside of the house recording damages. You can use data like ICEYE synthetic aperture radar, flood extent, and depth information overlaid with structures to understand how high the water was in a structure and get the associated damages. You can visually look at post-event imagery, assessing damages. And then what we're going to talk about a little bit more is using machine learning to automate the process. Next slide. So traditional assessments, when you're using post-event imagery, it typically takes somebody about 30 seconds to make that determination. And with a wide variety of analysts and backgrounds looking at that particular imagery, you're going to get inconsistency in determinations. Also, it takes a long time, 30 seconds per structure times thousands and thousands sometimes in an impact area. And a lot of times analysts will experience burnout. It's really tough to look at this imagery and see the damages. Next slide. So an automated approach, when you're teaching a computer to view that imagery, it really provides increased consistency. But just like Dragos mentioned, there is no machine learning model that is perfect. So you need a human to review the outputs so that you're better understanding how the model is performing and ultimately using this information to expedite assessments. Next slide. So what we did at Dewberry is we invested in machine learning methods for a variety of different things. But again, I'm focusing here on geospatial damage assessments. We wanted to think about what problem were we trying to solve. In this case, damages from wind and fire and others. But the biggest time-consuming part of developing a machine learning model is the training data. So we looked at a lot of different image types, as well as a lot of different disasters across the United States to get different geographical areas to then train and calibrate a model. When we were developing the model, the biggest priority for us was performance. We wanted to get the output quickly. So then when we run our model after an event, after the imagery is required, we can then retrain our model. So we're not just doing it one and done, we're constantly improving our machine learning efforts. Next slide. So what? So what does that mean? So after Hurricane Ian, we ran 4.1 million assessments on structures. So if you think about, if it takes 30 seconds for a person to analyze one structure, that would take one person 16 years. Obviously faster using machine learning, like Dragos also alluded to. But then now what? How is that information used? So it's used in the case of Ian, $80 million was expedited to disaster survivors as a result of this information. That's what I want to see moving forward, is how geospatial technology can be integrated into operations. Next slide. There are so many uses for geospatial damage assessments, including a critical input into debris estimation volumes and removal costs. So I am hoping that this gets you thinking about how you can integrate geospatial data and analysis into your operations. Next slide. And I believe these slides will be posted, but here are some resources for you to use to get started developing your own machine learning methods and developing a plan on how you are going to use geospatial data, as well as some resources on existing data that's out there. Back to you, Mike.
Thanks, Catherine. That was actually really, really cumulative and informative there. I do have some questions around, I think both you and Dragos got on the same point here of AI and machine learning can do what would otherwise take humans years to do, but you still need that human element there to interpret the data, to look at the data. So what are some of the ways that you've got that collaborative approach between the AI and the humans within the structure of what you guys are doing with FEMA? What are some of the different elements that you're supporting there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Hurricane Ian example is pretty amazing. Taking and using machine learning that takes something that might take months to do and shortening it to minutes. But I don't want to stop there. I mean, this technology gives, because it can analyze so much data over such a large geographical area, you can get that comprehensive view of initial impact, which can and should change the way emergency managers' operations go. So like take debris operations as an example. So with that comprehensive view across the entire county or entire state even, you can now start to take a more proactive approach and strategic approach to debris operation, prioritizing debris removal efforts based on known information, not just a bunch of hearsay that you're hearing at the Emergency Operations Center.
And then for Jeff, how do programs like ESRI then enable some of the work that Catherine and the team are doing and enable the emergency management community to better utilize machine learning approach?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways in which that happens. And really, there's work that ESRI is doing to invest in improving those 4 key areas that Catherine talked about. Field, for example, FEMA has standardized on, Survey 123 for the individual assistance and public assistance program using ESRI tools. And I mean, that was just put into practice with the recent tornadoes in Little Rock and Sussex County, Delaware. I mean, the modeled side of things, that there's a whole aspect of what Catherine talked about in terms of, being able to, correlate all of this information that's coming in from a variety of different sources, looking at things like, social vulnerability and equity from an analytic perspective, to pull that together. But I guess, at the end of all that, I just want to foot stomp, what Catherine said, $80 million into the hands of survivors, faster, thanks to the use of AI and ML, and Earth observation, technology. So at the end of the day, I mean, I think that's the real value and the benefit, right? Improving outcomes for survivors. And I think that's just a great example to kind of walk through. So really exciting things, on the horizon for all of us.
And I generally want to keep the Q&A for the end here, but there was a question that popped up that I really want to get answered. Jeff, you kind of touched on it, but for all of you, to what extent is equity, especially social vulnerability information, incorporated into either the machine learning approach or incorporated into the disaster response and recovery efforts or into the GIS technology?
And I guess just to build on that a little bit further, right? Once we have an understanding of the impact, now we need to figure out where to apply those resources, judiciously, right? Where are we going to set up, points of distribution, and are we doing that in an equitable way and based on the social vulnerability and other kind of demographic, variables? So, I mean, having this information, at our fingertips, quickly to understand impact, now we can, further on, some of our GIS analytic, best practices to really make sure that we're doing the job right. So,
yeah. And just to kind of expand on what Jeff is saying, I mean, having that information at the fingertips is key, right? Knowing where your social vulnerability data are located and understanding how to analyze it with geospatial damage assessments or with other post-event imagery is key to then be able to have a more equitable approach to using this information.
That's a huge thing for the insurance industry too, is incorporating equity into how insurance is distributed and delivered. And that's actually a lot of what we're working on now with community-based catastrophe insurance pools, where we work with organizations or with cities that can actually take on that insurance on behalf of vulnerable segments of the population and make sure that it gets distributed appropriately in big catastrophe events.
So I do want to touch on the CBCI, Aaron, and what that means for emergency management and what it means for equity as a whole for communities. But let me shift over just to insurance as a whole, taking a brief step back from Earth observation. As we've seen time and time again, there's two main ways that communities can recover financially from a disaster. You've got the federal and state funds via the likes of FEMA or SBA or other agencies on the ground, and insurance, such as a traditional homeowner's policy or flood insurance. On the latter, oftentimes, though, we've seen that people don't realize what they are and what they're not insured for. According to a 2020 Policy Genius survey on home insurance literacy, 53% of homeowners do not know that they're not insured for flood. So this can create massive problems in the immediate recovery stage of a disaster. It can place a burden on organizations like FEMA to provide additional assistance, and leaves a large portion of the population fighting to recover after a disaster. So, Aaron, on that whole note, can you help to explain what the protection gap is and why it's important in the US and globally to close it?
Yeah. And now that the ball is, I guess, officially passed to the insurance part, I also want to thank NEMA and thank ICEYE for inviting us to participate in this session today. So the protection gap is generally the difference between economic loss and insured loss, or loss that's transferred to the insurance sector following a natural catastrophe. And in different areas of the world, this percentage can be wildly different. I mentioned in New Zealand, it's actually quite low. New Zealand is one of the rare places in the world where it's quite low. You also have examples in like Switzerland and the UK where it's quite low. But generally in the world, this difference between the two is quite high. In the US, for example, over the last 10 years, there's been about $1.1 trillion in economic loss from natural catastrophes, of which just under 600 million has been insured. And so that leaves a protection gap percentage of about 45%. And so this is, in different parts of the world, it can be even higher than that. There are parts of Southeast Asia where it's 80 or 90%. But what that does is it leaves those who are in that middle period, or in the protection gap, with a lot of uncertainty. And so they don't know exactly who's going to come in and recover, whether it's just going to be the government, the insurer of last resort, or whether they're going to be footing the bill themselves. And so closing the protection gap has long been a mission of the insurance industry, and it might sound like a fitting goal for an insurer, but it actually has a lot more value to society than it does for the insurance markets. Because disasters are this reminder that every dollar spent on repair or rebuilding or recovery is a dollar that's not spent on improving infrastructure or environmental protections or just more generally growth. And so this is something that comes up time and time again in disasters, and it's really kind of starkly illuminated in like small island developing states, where you can have a hurricane or an earthquake that comes through and basically destroys the entire economy. So earlier I mentioned that that Christchurch sequence disrupted about 20% of the GDP for New Zealand. But you can have 100 or 200 or 300% of the GDP for a small island disrupted with a single event. And so when you think about it that way, just spending a little bit up front to proactively budget for unexpected losses frees up future spending and helps improve people's lives in general.
So staying on the peril of flood, or going back to the peril of flood, between 1996 and 2019, 99% of counties in the US were impacted by a flooding disaster, according to FEMA. It's not a localized issue, it's an issue everywhere. So what are some of the innovative ways the insurance industry then is stepping in to close that protection gap and supporting the response, the recovery, and ultimately the resilience of the communities and of the states that are impacted?
Yeah, so flood is ubiquitous. It's everywhere in the world, and it's happening all the time. And so when you think about insurance, there's kind of two fundamental principles. The first is evaluating the frequency and the severity of a risk. And that's how we price the risk. That's how we put a premium value on whatever the policy is. And the second is on settlement. And so that's figuring out when something bad happens, how bad was it? And so traditional insurance, we build kind of these complex numerical models to evaluate the risk. So we have a good idea of what the frequency and the severity of those risks are. And then when a claim happens, we send somebody out in the field to evaluate it. And that has worked for a long time, but it does have some downsides to it. It can be slow, as we see a lot of the times in really widespread natural disasters. So it can take years to settle claims. There are often exclusions for business interruption, and particularly for public entities for emergency expenses. And then there's also deductibles and things that are put into insurance policies that you begrudgingly pay, but they're actually put in there to control the cost of the policy and try to push it so it's only for extreme events. So another class of insurance is newer, and that's what's actually shown on the slide here. And this is what's known as parametric insurance. And so it uses an objective measure of an event. So for a hurricane, it could be the category of the hurricane. For an earthquake, it could be the magnitude, it could be many other things. But usually then they also settle objectively. So if that hurricane enters a certain geographic region and it's a category 2 or above, it would trigger a payout. So not only the insurance and the claim settlement agent knows what that is, but also the buyer knows what it is, because they can look at a map and see if the hurricane went inside that area. And so this adds a level of transparency that insurance often has not had. And so I used hurricane as an example. It's a little more tangible, but you can also think about it in terms of flood. And that's one of the products that we've launched recently. And so if you go to the next slide. So with flood, in partnering with ICEYE, what we've been able to do is put together a product where we actually can see in near real time, as Jeff was showing earlier, with that kind of slider view, in that same kind of rapid analysis that they're doing there, we can use that information to assess how much of a certain insured area might be underwater. And so we can do this many ways, but one way that we did it recently for a project in New York City, that was in partnership with the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, where we focused in the city on areas where we could say, if a certain percentage of the area is flooded, then we trigger a payout. And so that's kind of it's a simplistic instrument, but it also has broad coverage to get back at this kind of equity angle for covering populations, in particular low and middle income populations in New York City, that were very vulnerable to flooding. So if you go to the next slide, and an example of just kind of what that looks like is if you take this actually isn't ICEYE imagery. This is a scenario analysis that New York City put together for Sandy, kind of a post-event view, and then a simulated event, kind of their worst case scenario event. And if we overlay that with this kind of the structure that we put together, for an event like Sandy, that was very significant, this would have paid out about 20% of the total limit that was available for the entire policy. But what we're really trying to target are these really worst case scenarios where, if we have a big portion of the city that's flooded, and this pays out. And so the idea of this is that we can get, when something really bad happens, we can get money in the hands of the people who need it really quickly afterwards.
So these are all really, I think, cool, new, innovative ways, Aaron, to help build more disaster resilience for communities. And my question would be, how is Earth observation really enabling these projects?
I mean, the insurance industry relies on Earth observation for everything. It's every time there's kind of a step change in products that we can offer, a lot of it's driven by, like when SRTM came out, having new high resolution elevation models, that changes a lot of things. Having land use and land cover models changes how we can model different phenomenon. And so it allows us to develop better models to price insurance, so that hopefully makes the insurance more efficient. And then these near real time deliveries, like we get with ICEYE, allow us, this facilitates settlement, empowers these parametric contracts. And so this like high resolution, I guess, weather agnostic imagery has allowed us to branch out from traditional parametric products. So to go back to this example in New York City, a couple of the original proposals were to do a cat in a box, so kind of like that structure I described earlier. But then the city told us that they were concerned with events like Hurricane Ida, which was a post-tropical depression by the time it made it to New York City and wouldn't have triggered any sort of cat in a box. And even Hurricane Sandy was actually quite low category when it eventually made landfall and probably wouldn't have triggered either. And so to be able to focus the parametric on the actual phenomenon or the risk of interest instead of using a proxy, that opens up a whole new area of parametric product that allows us to really lower what we call the basis risk, which is the difference between the amount of loss that the client incurred and the amount of payout that they get from the policy.
Yeah, I think you kind of just answered it, but as far as the New York City placement goes, why is this so groundbreaking? And obviously everyone here is not from New York City, not everyone lives in New York City, but why is this important for locals and states to kind of pay attention to and potentially scale in the future?
I think we touched on it earlier with the kind of social vulnerability angle, where this was one of the first examples of this community-based catastrophe insurance idea, where an organization in New York City is taking out a policy ostensibly for the benefit of vulnerable populations in the city. And so I think, take the technology aside, the technology is a cool part of it and is an essential part of it. But having a new mechanism for delivering protection to vulnerable members of the community, I think that's really what made it groundbreaking. And then also in doing so, it brought together stakeholders from the city, from data vendors like yourself, from the insurance industry, and from nonprofits that we worked with, and really built a coalition of people to bring this product together.
I'll go a step further too. Oftentimes with certain subsidies or certain assistance after a storm, the funds have to be used a certain way. They have to be used for things like temporary housing or used to rebuild something like how it was before. Do you have those same limitations then on an insurance product like CBCI?
Generally, no. I mean, you can set them up to be as restrictive or unrestrictive as you like, but the way that we try to make these policies is so that it's just cash in hand. And the idea is that we don't know exactly what people need to spend money on after a natural catastrophe. And that's been shown time and time again, throughout the world, that cash is king when it comes to having effective natural disaster recovery. And so that's the idea behind a lot of parametric products, is that we just want to enable people to recover using whatever methods they need, and we provide the funding to do it. And that's really a big difference between parametric insurance and traditional indemnity insurance. Traditional insurance, somebody comes out and looks at, I don't know, the part of your house that's broken, and then they help you figure out how to fix exactly that part of your house, but it doesn't have to do with any other ancillary damage you might have.
So sticking to the kind of equity angle here, in FEMA's 2022 to 2026 strategic plan, there's 3 ambitious goals. There's instill equity as a foundation of emergency management. I think we've touched somewhat on that. Lead the whole community in climate resilience, and promote and sustain a ready FEMA and prepared nation. So this is to all of you. How do you see Earth observation technology, like either we've discussed today or others that we haven't discussed, helping FEMA, helping the nation, helping agencies like FEMA, helping New Zealand to accomplish goals like this?
Michael, if you want, I can go first.
Great.
So first of all, just from our lessons learned and how can actually Earth observation and geospatial tap into policies, into plans for for a nation, for a region, or for a city. First of all, what I would say is, first of all, as an organization, have in place a strategy at all the times for Earth observation and geospatial. So when I say strategy, it doesn't have to be a massive document. It has to be just a 1 to 3 year plan, or even just a roadmap to keep you on track with the technology and see how the technology can tap into those higher goals. Now that the strategy drives the technology and the data, and that data can be used on a BAU, like business as usual, on an ongoing basis. And that can serve policies, different stakeholders, but it also becomes the foundation for emergency situations. So the baseline ongoingly, and then when emergency situation shows up, you have the foundation set up. Now, the next step is, once that's rolling, we have learned it's important to have a plan in advance to where do you get the data from, what do you do with it when a situation like this happens, and ideally plan and meet the contacts from companies, from EO companies beforehand, because you don't have time when disaster strikes to go on LinkedIn and search who do I contact, send an email via the website. You have to have the contacts in place beforehand. And also, most EO companies, including ICEYE, they have dedicated services for disaster management. So I would just reach out before, in times of peace, to understand their offering. And also, I think this is probably something that hopefully nobody has to learn the hard way. But just as it was mentioned before, invest a bit of money in advance, have an expert, and this is, I cannot stress this enough, have somebody on your team who understands Earth observation, who understands geospatial, because hiring one expert who knows what to do in an emergency situation can save millions of dollars on the long run. And I tell you why. It's because when a disaster strikes, if you don't have somebody who's an expert who understands what data to go for, what technology to use, if somebody who's not an expert comes and does the work, even with the best intentions and heart, they might buy whatever data they think or heard about, and then you spend $500,000, you spend even more, and then you realize what you bought is not fit for purpose, and then you have to go back and start the process all over again. So it's a lot safer to have somebody on the team who understands this, that the moment something happens, the strategy is in place, the plan is in place, the contacts are in place, and they can just basically activate what's waiting in the background. So that's some of the lessons from our side in New Zealand.
I think that's super helpful advice. I'd turn it to Catherine, Jeff, Aaron, if you guys have anything to add on essentially what would be the best way for emergency managers to get involved with utilizing Earth observation for response, for recovery, for resilience.
Yeah, and I guess one thing in the list of resources I provided, one of the resources is just that it's a template from the National Alliance for Public Safety Geospatial on how to develop a geospatial game plan. So it's a great resource for anyone to really use as a starting point. And I couldn't agree more. Having a plan in place on how you're going to use the data and technology is extremely important. You don't want to do it during a disaster, the mad scramble for what information is out there and trying to find the necessary documentation for reimbursement. Having a plan ahead of time, understanding your data, understanding who to contact to get access to your data and how it can be used in your operations is really key.
And I would say, I would add on to that, part of that's the people, right? Do you have the people in-house that have the knowledge and skills and expertise? And if you don't, do you need to get them, or maybe you need to build up some of their, kind of, capabilities? And, as Dragos was alluding to, one of my favorite disaster cliches is disasters aren't the time to exchange business cards, right? You need to have those relationships and networks, in place, first, and really understand those, kind of capabilities. And it's really kind of the people part and making all that work and learning from each other that I think will, help us be better prepared and help us meet those, 3 challenges in F1 strategic goals. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the cliche in the insurance industry is that every dollar of ex ante planning is $4 of ex post recovery cost. And so we're always encouraging people to make a plan early on. One other thing I'll mention with Earth observation is I talked a little bit about parametric insurance, but also it's powering traditional insurance too. And so claim settlement has traditionally been this kind of slow cog of the insurance world, but Earth observation is powering that to speed up. And so one of the programs, like we have a program at Swiss Re where we take visual imagery and we look at that exactly post-disaster to evaluate where damaged roofs are and where damaged buildings are, exactly like the work that Catherine was presenting on. And so these are systems and solutions that we're developing to try to expedite that process after a disaster happens, to both, catalyze it with parametric insurance as a new structure and also make traditional insurance more efficient.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to turn to the Q&A portion of this now from the audience. We've got a number of good questions. I asked the one on equity, but had a number come through. So as I ask these, just generally, any one of you four that can answer, please feel free to jump in. The first question, with wildland fires, I'm wondering about the ability to combine ICEYE data with AI/ML to anticipate where future landslides, mud flows might be predicted based on geography, severity of the burn, and amount of precipitation. I'll take the first crack at this, actually. Certainly, I think that the power of synthetic aperture radar data goes beyond only identifying floods, only identifying wildfires. There's a lot out there with synthetic aperture radar that we are just now scratching the surface on. Up until recently, it's largely been a government technology where you can build 1 or 2 satellites with it and put those up and call it a constellation. And maybe you get revisit rates of 4 or 5 or 6 days. It's really until recently that you have these constellations, ICEYE being the largest, where you can see everywhere several times a day. And so you can start to build out these predictive models that take into account that imagery. And so I think that what we're going to see in the coming months and years with SAR technology is the ability to better predict disasters before they occur, not just after they occur. I don't know, Dragos, Catherine, Jeff, Aaron, if you guys had anything to add to that one. All right. I didn't mean to just set the stage for me to answer, but it was the first question on the list. Next question. This one, I think, Dragos, is probably more for you, but where does the international charter space and major disasters fit within your strategy?
Yes, so we are not part of that. For the reason is because we are not a central national agency. So we are Auckland Council. It's the local. So we have not used that as part of these responses.
Okay. I'll throw on a little bit of a plug on ICEYE for us here. From the ICEYE perspective, we are a member of the charter. We have provided free SAR imagery to support response to major catastrophic events. Certainly, we feel an obligation to support the public good, and we do seek to provide information where we can support, particularly in those underserved or lesser developed areas of the world. In the more developed areas of the world, the US and New Zealand, we do work with governments at all levels, the commercial insurance and reinsurance industries to help support their response efforts as well.
I didn't know that, Michael. That's great. I think I really commend you for that. I mean, as part of our disaster response program work, especially as we get requests across the globe, we're always directing folks to that as a resource, and great that you all are kind of participating in that and to unlock just a bunch of, Earth observation data to help, where it's needed most. So that's great.
Yeah, we certainly like to be zealots in the Earth observation industry, and so any way we could advance it. So we already talked about the equity one. Next question would be, what data gaps exist, and what is the next area of innovation in this space? And so that could be Earth observation, that could be Earth observation applied to disaster response and recovery, and I think it could be Earth observation with machine learning applied to it.
I guess I'll take the first crack at this one. One of the things that we've all talked about is how Earth observation is collected to give that comprehensive picture of event impact. Typically, it's collected one time and it's used for response efforts. But now as imagery, lots of different imagery types are out there, sensors out there collecting information. Imagine if it could be collected on a reoccurring basis, weekly, monthly, and you're starting to use it and analyze it, not just for response, to be monitoring recovery operations, things like debris removal efforts. That's really where I see the Earth observation for emergency management going as it gets more and more widely used, incorporated into response and recovery operations.
And building on top of that, as Catherine said, building up that catalog of, impact, on multiple kind of occasions. We can also think about how can we look at that to see how are some of our resilience or mitigation efforts, working, right? Is this, based on the data that happened and what can we see? Where's investment in resiliency and mitigation working or not, given the large volume of data and library of collections?
Yeah, and Jeff, unfortunately, some of these places are getting hit time and time again. So not only can you identify potential mitigation measures and resilience actions, you can also start to monitor their performance and start to look at losses avoided as a result of implementing those mitigation measures.
I'll say for our industry, we're always looking for new areas where we can gain insight. And so whenever there's a new application of an Earth observation technology, we're interested in that. So just this one talking about wildfires and their impacts on landslides and coupling that data, if there's a way to get a better view of that risk using EO data, then that's something we're certainly interested in. One gap that we have with kind of the current state of Earth observation data is, as fast as it is, and as good as ICEYE is at capturing it, there's still some data gaps that we have. And so you think about like a really quick flash flood or some rainfall that's in steep terrain where we have hard time actually capturing the imagery. Those are limitations of the current approach. And so as the technology improves, then we expect those to improve as well. But those are, I guess, data gaps to answer the question.
And I think also, if I may add to that, I think data, I remember 10, 15 years ago when I was doing my PhD, to have one satellite image was like, we found a piece of gold. But nowadays data there's so much and the quality is so high and basically it's accessible. However, turning that data into insights and turning data into knowledge and having the capability to act on it, I think that's something that it's needed more nowadays.
Great. There was an interesting point in the chat, actually, that I did just want to mention from Kid Hope, and that it was less than 10 years ago, U.S. law prevented the use of drones to survey the full extent of the damage caused by the also landslide in Washington State. And so, we've been talking about how Earth observation technology, whether it's drones or aerial imagery or satellites, has continued to advance. There's certainly that step behind that of law and regulations and how the industry then adapts to that. So let me turn that into a question for you all. Have you seen the industry have to adapt to the technology and the speed at which the technology has advanced? And are there ways that you're seeing that kind of regulation change a little bit more recently? Or if not, that's okay.
I mean,
Go
ahead, Jeff.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Catherine.
Okay. I mean, I guess what I was going to say is, I mean, technology is rapidly evolving, and I think there's a question further down in the chat about additional sensors that are out there and how you're incorporating that, and that's the thing. We can't stop with just one. We have to be constantly looking at new technologies, new sensors, new information, and updating whatever models or analysis we're doing to help the emergency management community, and recognizing that there are privacy considerations. There is a need to consider what drones are collecting, and if it's faces and license plate and personally identifiable information. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to consider around that, but working with a plan, like we mentioned, and putting that into your plan as one of your considerations to think about is extremely important.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot of challenges from a policy perspective, and you also look at people are just eager to help, right? But sometimes that can cause issues, right? Drones or UASs in airspace for wildfires where they shouldn't be, that actually may stop aerial operations just from a safety concern, or from a tornado chasing perspective. How do you there's all these drones that are you see after the fact, but can any of that be leveraged as a part of this GIS disaster response community, the EO community, to be able to support recovery operations and response operations like we've talked about today? So yeah, certainly a lot to consider from a policy perspective.
Let me shift back to the question of equity. It's come up a few times here. We've got some more good questions on it. The question is specifically, can FEMA access census data as a layer to evaluate the SAR and GIS data, presumably the ICEYE data, to pinpoint need? I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that our partners with FEMA, New Light Technologies, does some of this where they're taking in socioeconomic data and demographic data to be able to indicate areas of greatest concern for FEMA. So I know that the answer to that question is yes, but I wasn't sure either Catherine or Aaron or Jeff or Dragos, if you had anything to add to that as well.
Yeah, I mean,
we've used that data before to also try to work with our public entity partners to identify areas of need. But outside of that, we don't generally use it too much in our evaluations.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's a wholehearted yes. Yeah, there's census data from what we've observed just from the GIS community within FEMA. It's used in a lot of different areas, different indicators for thresholds. I mean, obviously the National Risk Index that has recently just been updated. That's a huge social vulnerability is a huge part of that as well. So we've seen many great examples of the use of census data across the community.
Great. What kind of models are being used for geospatial damage assessment? So, Catherine, I think this one is probably directly towards you.
Yeah, it's interesting because what do we mean by models, right? Because there's a lot of different types of models for geospatial damage assessment. There's the model geospatial damage assessments themselves, where we're using data like ICEYE synthetic aperture radar, flood extents and depths to try to understand, what the depth of flooding was at a particular structure. But then there's a wide variety of models around machine learning, and lots to evaluate to determine the best model to get the best output results that you're going to need for whatever analysis you're trying to do. So I think this is a great question, and I think it deserves its own session and talk about it. But I did around data gaps. I did also want to mention one data gap that I see a lot is, when we're looking at those modeled damage assessments, trying to understand the depth of flooding at a structure. Sometimes it can be challenging to understand, is that structure elevated or not? A lot of times we don't have that information, so we just assume that the structure is at grade, and that's typically incorrect. So finding ways to understand, is the structure elevated? Is there freeboard? How high up is the structure? Because if it's not flooded, then it's going to see a lot less impact. So that's it. That's a data gap that I've seen from what we've been working on.
Great. Let me shift back to the insurance side of it. There's a question around NFIP. So, Aaron, are parametric policies connected to NFIP's CRS program?
So I assume that's for the community rating system. And
I believe so, yeah.
And I don't know if these are considered as kind of ways to reduce your premium on NFIP. If you had, for example, a parametric policy that would then, protect a certain amount of your property. So that's something I'd have to look into because I don't know exactly how it's considered by NFIP. But
yeah,
I guess, but fundamentally, it could be because it is an additional protection that would exist outside of the NFIP traditional policy.
Yeah, I think that currently they're not directly considered in the CRS, like you said, but it certainly would be an opportunity for FEMA to support these types of programs.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm just skipping around a little bit. So this is an interesting question. What's the path forward for products and services to be shared across the whole community during response and recovery, given their oftentimes proprietary nature? I don't know if anyone wants to start on that one.
I mean, I can give an example again to go back to this New York City transaction that we did. So we worked with ICEYE, and ICEYE was a good partner in this to agree with the client to deliver the ICEYE flood footprints following an event. And so that's one way that we can kind of bring in objectivity to these types of solutions too, so that everybody is seeing the same data and there's no real asymmetric information from anybody's perspective. And so I think that generally is a rule that we like to apply in a lot of the insurance that I work in, is bringing everybody in to see the same data, so there's no uncertainty about what's getting done.
And I also can answer from New Zealand point. It wasn't only Auckland that was hit by a flood. It was actually half of the North Island and other councils, other regions as well. So in New Zealand, we have a central emergency management agency based out of Wellington in New Zealand. So they coordinated the all of government acquisitions and licenses for Earth observation data. So actually, they purchased an ICEYE license for all of government. And then under that license, various regions, organizations were able to tap into the same data, the same products, and use the same source of truth throughout the country.
So let me actually turn this then from that, Dragos, to Jeff, because I think, EULAs aside and contracts aside, ESRI is kind of a nice tool to be able to bring that path forward for products and services to be shared from one community to another, from one state to another, from one nation to another.
Yeah, we've certainly seen that approach play out a bunch. There's mechanisms inside the ESRI software to essentially allow secure sharing of information. What I kind of think of like tunnels between organizations. So as Dragos mentioned, if there's from a purchasing perspective or a licensing perspective, it's licensed at all of government level. Now we can set up these networks from a GIS data sharing perspective to facilitate that secure information sharing. To adhere to the licensing needs, but making sure that data is broadly available to those that need it. And we've seen that approach play out very well over the past couple of years, really amplified frankly during COVID, right, to for a variety of different reasons. So a lot of great information sharing best practices that we've seen with the technology to help with the exact issue that we're discussing here in this question.
Yeah, so in New Zealand, we do use the ESRI technology for exactly this purpose. So all the secure groups under which this information has been shared is based on ESRI.
So I've got one other question so far, unless more pop up here in the chat. The question is, and this would be, Dragos, I think mainly to you, but as well, perhaps, Catherine, on your machine learning efforts, are you leveraging any imagery from other sources, such as fixed wing or drone or orthophoto inputs, or is it geospatial to focus? and future focus of the imagery gathering efforts? And if so, what type of asset is best suited? Taking a first crack at it, I would think the type of asset, the type of satellite or drone or aerial imagery kind of depends on the natural hazard that you're trying to identify. But Dragos, I don't know if you have any thoughts there.
Yes. So actually, I started this this presentation with exactly the same idea that we have used everything from drones to localized areas, very high resolution. And then we used helicopters. So the moment the floods, the moment it was safe to fly, team members from the council actually jumped on helicopters and they went around taking photographs of the region to see the extent of the damage. We used ICEYE the moment the flooding, actually even before the flooding was announced, before the cyclone came. We were in touch with ICEYE and we worked very closely, and they were really amazing to actually plan and prepare for when the disaster hit, to be able to capture the data. And after that, we went to Maxar, and because after the clouds have gone, we needed to be able to map out all the landslides. So that's a post-event and into the recovery mode. So it's pretty much, you can use whatever is best for what you're trying to achieve, and depending on the area. We cannot fly drones for a 5,000 square kilometer region, but for a quick intervention in some areas, they are great. And for the whole region, satellites are the only way to go. And one challenge I often see is that technical teams, geospatial people say, well, the leadership doesn't really get what, they don't speak the geospatial language, they don't really speak the Earth observation language. And the key to that is simply explaining that the only way to have a full picture of the entire region is from satellites. If you're driving, if you're walking through, you can only have bits and pieces where people on the ground give you information. But if you want to have the whole view of the whole region, satellites and geospatial is the only option you have, really.
Okay, great. So I don't see any other questions. So I think that concludes the Q&A portion of the webinar. I want to thank NEMA again for the opportunity on what has been an excellent discussion on Earth observation technology, on machine learning, on geospatial technology, on community-based catastrophe insurance and disaster risk financing. I want to thank the speakers here for their time, their expertise, their thought-provoking answers. So Dragos, Catherine, Aaron, and Jeff, thank you guys so much. And of course, I'd like to thank everyone at home who's been listening and hopefully learning some. You could always reach out to me after this if you have any specific questions around ICEYE's capabilities, or if you need me to route your email to any of the panelists here as well, I could certainly do that. And you could always find me at any of the NEMA forums. So we just had the mid-forum, certainly be at the annual forum later this fall as well. So I think with that, pass it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And also thank you to Jeff, Aaron, Dragos, and Catherine for being with us today and sharing your expertise. It was a very well-rounded discussion, and I really appreciate you being here. And also thank you to our great audience for participating. You can find out more about the NEMA Empowerment e-learning series and how to sponsor one of your own on the resources section of the NEMA website, www.nemaweb.org. Thank you again for attending. Take care, stay well, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.